Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to extend debate for each side by 10 minutes, and I also ask you see that all members may have 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks and to exclude extraneous material on this measure.
Without objection.
Thank you. I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, on Saturday, October 7th, Israelis awoke to rockets raining down on them from Gaza, and gunmen broke down their doors and invaded their homes. Hamas terrorists killed babies and toddlers. They killed elderly grandmothers and grandfathers. They killed moms and dads. They killed teenage kids in their homes. No one was spared from their brutality. Following World War II, my father's war, I never believed the world would bear witness to the slaughter of the Jewish people like we have seen at the bloody hands of Hamas. October 7th was the deadliest day for the Jewish people since the Holocaust. Additionally, Hamas is holding 220 hostages, including Americans. This is a flyer, mother and son taken hostage by Hamas. Hashtag bring them home now. They're using them as human shields and threatening to execute them. They must all be released unconditionally now. This is one of the darkest moments in the history of the state of Israel. I was in one of the kibbutzes right on the border of Gaza last year, meeting with members of the community. I saw their daycare center. That very same kibbutz was overrun by 70 Hamas terrorists. Many of the residents I met were slaughtered. Most viciously, the babies and the children I visited in the daycare center were slaughtered, shot to death, beheaded, and burned alive. When the press says it didn't happen, they're just wrong. It did. Because I've seen the pictures of the burned babies and the decapitated children and the blood that you see here in the babies' cribs, for God's sakes. What is going on in this world today? In one of the most horrific stories to emerge, a pregnant woman who had her baby cut out in front of her very eyes as they murdered her baby before her and before they shot her in the head. Simply put, Mr. Speaker, they are monsters. At a music festival to celebrate peace, chaos, gunfire, and explosions ripped through the air, piercing hundreds of bodies with bullets and shrapnel. And while the attendees attempted to flee the area, gunmen surrounded them from every direction. In total, 260 attendees assembled in peace to enjoy music were massacred. Among other atrocities we have heard reported include children with their hands bound, shot in the back of the head execution style. Women who were raped and slaughtered, one of whom was dragged through the streets of Gaza. Families, including babies and young children, were burned alive in their homes in front of their parents. The beheading of Israeli soldiers and parents gunned down as they shielded their children before the onslaught of gunfire. This is sheer terror. It's evil, and it cannot stand in this world. We are witnessing in real time Hamas carrying out their covenant that outlines their goal of eradicating Israel through jihad. In fact, their covenant states, quote, Israel will exist and will continue to exist until Islam will obliterate it, just as it obliterated others before it. As they specifically discuss jihad, noting, quote, the day the enemies usurp part of Muslim land, jihad becomes the individual duty of every Muslim in the face of the Jews' usurpation. It is compulsory that the banner of jihad be raised. And Mr. Speaker, it was indeed raised on October 7th. To be completely clear, despite repeated efforts by Israel to secure peace, the Hamas covenant states, quote, peace initiatives and so-called peaceful solutions and international conferences are in contradiction to the principles of the Islamic resistant movement. There is no solution by the Palestinian problem except by jihad. This declaration calling on the annihilation of the Jewish state must be confronted with zero equivocation. And that is why I worked with my good friend, Ranking Member Meeks, to introduce this bipartisan resolution. It condemns in the strongest possible terms the atrocities of Hamas and reiterates Israel's right to defend herself, along with America's unwavering support for the state of Israel. All roads lead to Iran. Their fingerprints are all over this attack. They have consistently funded Hamas and other Palestinian groups to the tune of $100 million per year. This resolution condemns Hamas and Iran for its support of terrorist groups, such as Hamas and the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, while also calling for all sanctions on Iran to be fully enforced. So I urge my colleagues to support this important resolution. It will send a clear message across the world that terrorists and their sponsors will be held to account for their atrocities, their crimes against humanity, their crimes of genocide. On December 7th, 1941, in response to the bombing of Pearl Harbor, President Roosevelt said, "It was a date which will live in infamy." So too will October the 7th, 2023. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I urge support and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Texas reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
Gentleman is recognized.
I rise in support of this extraordinarily important resolution written with my friend and colleague, Chairman McCall. 18 days ago, the state of Israel suffered the greatest mass murder perpetuated against the Jewish people since the Holocaust, when Hamas terrorists invaded Israel by land, by sea, and by air. Behaving just like ISIS, Hamas terrorists murdered and beheaded soldiers and civilians alike. Babies were shot and burned in their cribs and reduced to smoldering piles of ash. Babies. Children were murdered. Teenagers were murdered. Men and women were murdered. Elderly people, including Holocaust survivors, murdered. Hamas has also taken 200 of those who survived into Gaza as hostages, including unaccompanied children, Holocaust survivors, and many American citizens. Mr. Speaker, Hamas's attack was truly unprecedented. And when you consider the size of Israel's population, proportionally it would be like 30,000 people dying in New York on 9/11. Just let that sink in a little. We must all acknowledge that Hamas is a cutthroat terrorist organization that exists solely to destroy Israel. And Hamas's terrorism does not help the Palestinians. And in this moment, it is critical for Israel to know that the United States of America stands firmly by its side in this battle against Hamas. Mr. Speaker, what I'm about to say next is also very important. There are innocent Palestinians in both Gaza and the West Bank that seek normal and free lives and want nothing to do with Hamas or other terrorist organizations. So we cannot lose sight of this. We must keep them, many of whom are also children, and their safety and their well-being in mind. And in the immediate term, we must find a way to ensure the safety of those innocents who are in Gaza's war zone. And I support the Biden administration's efforts toward that goal. The United Nations estimates that thousands of Palestinians have been killed since the terrorist attack on October the 7th. And we don't know for certain how many of those killed were civilians. But here's what we do know. We know that Hamas terrorists use Palestinians as human shields. And we know that every single one of them would be alive today if Hamas had not launched its terrorist attack. So we must be aware and do all that we can to stop this war from expanding beyond its current scope. The administration and our allies are working around the clock to send messages and warnings to Iran and Hezbollah to stay out. President Biden underscored this message during his recent travel to Israel. Do not test America's will. This Congress will have Israel's back as it degrades and eliminates Hamas terrorist infrastructure. We know that it won't take a day. It will be difficult. For too long, too many have been willing to contribute to the delegitimization of the state of Israel. It is deeply concerning that even global leaders are already whitewashing one of the worst terrorist attacks in history, while Hamas and its allies blanket cyberspace and with misinformation about this war. Just yesterday, Turkish President Erdogan said that Hamas is not a terrorist organization. It is a group of Mujahideen defending their lands. This from the mouth of a NATO ally who has his own concerns about terrorists as an existential threat to his country. President Erdogan's rhetoric is dead wrong. It is rank with hypocrisy, and its timing is extraordinarily dangerous. Mr. Speaker, the resolution before us is a bright spot of bipartisanship today during a very difficult time in American politics. 425 members of this House of Representatives have co-sponsored this resolution. And so there's no question in my mind that it will pass overwhelmingly, Democrats and Republicans alike. And most importantly, the American people believe in the Jewish state and believe in its survival. In the days, weeks, and months ahead, I know the United States will continue to stand steadfastly with Israel to assure its defense and its long-term security. We will also, as President Biden has outlined, remain committed to ensuring that civilians in Gaza have access to safe areas and continue to have access to food, water, medical care, and other assistance without diversions by Hamas. We must also stay keenly focused on working to get United States citizens and their immediate family members to exit Gaza safely. I want to conclude, Mr. Speaker, by raising an issue that the United States and Israel must address. What does a successful ground operation in Gaza look like? And how do we achieve the goal of leaving Gaza to a responsible Palestinian government if Israel's effort to remove Hamas is successful? One thing is for certain, the path to peace will require more Arab states to recognize that Israel has the right to exist. And that will hold firm and will make sure that we could have thereby a two-state solution. But if you say Israel does not have the right to exist, you're saying that you do not want peace. So I urge our Arab friends to join the Abraham Accords and acknowledge Israel's right to exist, because that's the pathway to peace in the Middle East. And to the people of Israel, I hope you learn of the passage of this resolution today and know that the United States Congress and the American people have your back. We mourn beside you and are working to provide the resources your government needs to defend you. We have deployed powerful military resources to the region to demonstrate just that support. We are working all of our diplomatic channels to assure your success. And we are in this together. We will not waver. We will not quit. We will stand with our ally, Israel. And with that, I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Smith, the chairman of the Foreign Affairs Subcommittee on Global Health, Human Rights, and International Organizations.
The gentleman from New Jersey is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you to the distinguished chairman and to the ranking member for this extraordinarily important resolution. Mr. Speaker, our great friend and ally Israel, with significant assistance from the United States, continues to respond to the cowardly Hamas invasion that includes Hamas's psychotic terrorists butchering innocent civilians, rape, hostage-taking, the beheading of babies, and daily indiscriminate missile attacks that are reminiscent of Nazi buzz bombs and V-2 rockets. Israel Prime Minister Netanyahu has said in the past that he would never allow a second Holocaust, nor should we. Anti-Semitism is at the root of Hamas's violence against Israel and every Jewish man, woman, and child. Israel's right to defend itself from this brutal invasion is absolute. Hamas's 1988 charter explicitly demands the absolute destruction of the state of Israel and proclaims, quote, Israel will exist and will continue to exist until Islam will obliterate it, close quote. Article 7 of the Hamas charter demands the slaughter of all Jews and says, the Jews will hide behind rocks and trees, and the rocks and trees will cry out, there is a Jew hiding behind me, come and kill him, close quote. Article 13 explicitly rejects initiatives for peace and reconciliation and states, quote, initiatives and so-called peaceful solutions and international conferences are contradictions to the principle of Islamic resistance movement. In its 2017 charter, Hamas reiterated its goal of wiping Israel off the face of the earth and said, and I quote, there is no alternative to a fully sovereign Palestinian state on the entire national Palestinian soil with Jerusalem as its capital. Like the Nazis before them, Hamas and its chief terrorism sponsor, Iran, are committing genocide against the Jews. The United States and all people committed to human rights and the rule of law must stand with Israel. That means our support
Gentleman's time has
and
expired.
prayers and the weapon systems to defeat
Gentleman's time has
Hamas.
expired. Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from New York is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, at this time, I'm proud to yield 2 minutes to the gentlewoman from North Carolina and a member of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, the Honorable Representative Kathy Manning.
Gentlewoman from North Carolina is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Ranking Member Meeks. 18 days ago, more than 1,000 Hamas terrorists invaded our democratic ally, Israel, and in the most gruesome, savage, and unimaginably barbaric manner attacked 22 Israeli towns, going house to house, slaughtering families, raping girls, beheading babies, setting fire to homes where children were hiding in safe rooms, burning them alive, and taking more than 200 people of 40 different nationalities hostage, taking infants and the elderly hostage. They massacred more than 260 young people attending an outdoor peace concert. They perpetrated the worst attack on the Jewish people since the Holocaust, slaughtering more than 1,400 people, including 39 Americans. And in committing these horrific crimes against humanity, they have brought disaster to the very people they govern, the Palestinian people. They hide their fighters among civilians. They place rocket launchers and weapons in schools and hospitals, in mosques and residential buildings, compounding their acts of evil. I was so proud that President Biden immediately expressed the full support of the United States for the state of Israel, and he traveled to Israel in a time of war to embrace the Israeli people, to show with his presence that the Jewish state has not only a right but a duty to defend itself against Hamas, a terrorist group that has in its charter as its foundational purpose to murder Jews and destroy the state of Israel. And make no mistake, when they shout from the river to the sea, they are calling for the total destruction of the state of Israel and ridding the Middle East of all Jews. Well, not on our watch. The United States will stand side by side with our democratic ally Israel. I urge my colleagues to join me in voting in support of this resolution.
Gentlewoman's time has expired. Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 2 minutes to the gentlelady from Missouri, the Vice Chair of the Committee on Foreign Affairs, Ms. Wagner.
The gentlewoman from Missouri is recognized for 2 minutes.
I thank the chairman. And, Mr. Speaker, I rise in support of HRES 771. Today, the House has an opportunity to demonstrate moral clarity and moral courage. These past few weeks have exposed a level of anti-Semitism in this nation that is frightening. Whether it is school children chanting for the genocide of Israelis by calling for removal from the river to the sea, or radicalized college students projecting anti-Semitic slogans on the side of school property, it is clear young Americans are being indoctrinated against Israel. These actions must be condemned. Hamas is a terror organization that slaughtered innocent women and children. Hamas is a terror organization that manipulated Western media into doing their bidding by spreading lies about attacks Israel did not commit. Hamas is a terror organization that steals foreign aid, using it to construct rockets and attack Israel. These are not my opinions, Mr. Speaker. They are facts. And yet too many refuse to call Hamas out for what it is: evil incarnate, focused solely on the destruction of the Jewish people. Mr. Speaker, the United States government must be united in support of Israel and against Hamas and anti-Semitism. There should be no equivocation from the White House when asked whether the rise of anti-Semitism is wrong. There should be no equivocation from the member of Congress about whether to stand with Israel or with terrorist groups like Hamas. Today, this body is speaking loudly to the international community that Israel must have the resources to defend itself from genocidal terrorists. With one voice, let us support HRES 771 and stand with Israel. And if, Mr. Speaker, you cannot bring yourself to support this resolution today, I would encourage any such member to do the right thing and resign from this body. And I yield back.
Gentlewoman yields back. Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from New York is recognized.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I'm proud to yield 1 minute to the former majority leader of this distinguished body, the gentleman from Maryland, the Honorable Steny Hoyer.
Gentleman from Maryland is recognized for 1 minute.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. For millennia, the Jews of the world have been subject all over the world to prejudice, hate, and violence. Mr. Speaker, I have visited Kfar Aza, kibbutz, over 4 times in the last 25 years. It was a place of community, and on October 7th, Hamas turned it into a place of slaughter. This brutal terrorist organization will pursue its genocidal, anti-Semitic mission to fight and kill Jews. That's their purpose. The Jewish state of Israel will cease to exist if their objectives are achieved. Hamas will not yield, and neither can we. As the resolution makes clear, we will stand by our ally Israel. Have their back, Mr. Chairman. Dozens of American civilians have been killed, wounded, and held captive in this war. We've also seen the scourge of anti-Semitism here in America. 30 more seconds?
Gentleman has yielded 30 seconds.
We must follow this resolution with action, and we must all vote for this resolution and speak with one voice. Action that shows the world that America will defend its allies in Israel, in Ukraine, and around the world. And I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Wilson, the chairman of the Foreign Affairs Subcommittee on the Middle East.
Gentleman from South Carolina is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I am grateful to support this bipartisan resolution which has been offered by our chairman, Mike McCall, and our ranking member, Greg Meeks. I was born with an appreciation of the people of Jewish faith. My birthplace of Charleston, South Carolina, was at the time of the American Revolution, had the largest Jewish population in the New World who had come here to escape oppression, to achieve freedom, which they achieved in America. I was grateful today to be the chairman of the Middle East Subcommittee and co-chairman of the Israel Caucus. Just 7 weeks ago today, I met with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who is so courageous and is serving there in Jerusalem. I pledged then my support of Israel to defend itself from a nuclear Iran, which also includes, of course, support of Israel from the barbarian invasion of Hamas, the puppets of Iran, who have conducted murder, killing hundreds of persons, 1,200 at least, and even possibly more, that indeed are puppets of Iran to kill people in Israel. Sadly, we're in a conflict we did not choose of dictators of rule of gun invading democracies with rule of law. On October 7th, which is the Israeli equivalent of 9/11 in Pearl Harbor, I was grateful to be attending the NATO Parliamentary Assembly in Copenhagen, Denmark, where with Finland and Sweden, Western civilization has never been more united to defend Ukraine, Israel, and Taiwan. America's resolve for Israel I saw firsthand on May 14, 2018, leading a House delegation to fulfill President Donald Trump's opening of the U.S. Embassy in Jerusalem with the extraordinary Ambassador David Friedman. I urge all my colleagues of both parties to support the resolution. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from New York is recognized.
I now proudly yield 2 minutes to a member of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, the gentleman from California, Representative Brad Sherman.
Gentleman from California is recognized for 2 minutes.
Of the importance of this resolution. The scenes from Gaza are horrendous, and some cry out for a ceasefire, but Hamas cannot follow a ceasefire. They exist, and it is in their charter. Kill every Jew in the Middle East. If they ever agreed to a ceasefire, they'd fall apart. They had a ceasefire on October 6th, which is why they killed 1,400 civilians on October 7th. We can get a ceasefire when Hamas agrees to disarm and release the hostages. And the loud voices demanding a ceasefire should be shouting at Hamas, demanding those two actions. We hear quotes from the Gaza Ministry of Health. The Gaza Ministry of Health counts as in their death counts the terrorists who are killed and mixes them with the civilians. And the Gaza Ministry of Health is under the control of Hamas. Hamas brutally murders Palestinians who dare to dissent. It forces innocent Palestinians to act as human shields. It steals aid meant for civilians. 30% of the time when it shoots a rocket in an effort to kill an Israeli civilian, the rocket never leaves Gaza. It falls down to earth where it may kill Palestinians, including those who died at that hospital in Gaza. And Israel is characterized as somehow a European colony. Keep in mind, the majority of Israeli Jews are there from Arab states and Iran, from which they have been expelled or persecuted. There has been, this is a Middle Eastern country of Middle Eastern descent from people who 2,000 years ago lived there, but also lived there right until the Arab states expelled them or persecuted them. I look forward to a time when we can have a two-state solution. That begins with the destruction of Hamas.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Speaker, I yield 1.5 minutes to the gentlelady from California, Ms. Kim, the chair of the Foreign Affairs Subcommittee on the Indo-Pacific.
Gentlewoman from California is recognized for 1.5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman, for yielding. And Mr. Speaker, I rise in strong support of this resolution to demonstrate that this House stands united with Israel as it defends itself against the barbaric war launched by Hamas and other terrorists. On October 7, we watched in horror as hundreds of terrorists poured across the Israel-Gaza border and massacred, kidnapped, and raped Israelis. It's abhorrent. This is at the hands of Hamas and Hezbollah terrorist groups backed and funded by the Iran regime. They want to wipe Israel off the map. Thousands of rockets have fallen on Israel and continue falling as we speak. This has been the worst attack on Jews since the Holocaust. I visited Israel last year, and I felt the constant threat of attack that the people of Israel face. And it reminded me of my time growing up in South Korea as a young girl after the Korean War. And I felt that constant threat coming from North Korea. So this is really personal to me. Hamas now holds around 200 hostages from Israel, the US, and other countries around the world. Israel has a right to defend itself against terrorist aggression, bring its hostages home, and its right to exist. I thank Chairman McCall and Ranking Member Meeks for leading this resolution, and I urge my colleagues to support it. I yield the balance of my time.
Gentlewoman yields the balance of his time. Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from New York is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I now proudly yield 2 minutes to a strong member of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, the gentleman from Illinois, Representative Brad Snyder.
Gentleman from Illinois is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Chairman McCall, Ranking Member Meeks, thank you for leading on this resolution. Hamas is a terrorist organization backed by Iran, driven by hate, committed to genocide. Since its founding, Hamas has been dedicated to the destruction of Israel and the murder of Jews. All who cherish life, value democracy, and seek justice must resolutely condemn Hamas, condemn its heinous attack on October 7th, and condemn its war with Israel. And Israel has the right, Israel has the responsibility to defend itself against Hamas, to protect its citizens, to secure its borders, and to rescue its hostages, no matter how long it takes. Peace will only come after Hamas releases the hostages. Hamas ceases launching rockets at Israeli neighborhoods, from Palestinian neighborhoods, schools, and hospitals. And Hamas no longer governs Gaza or threatens Israel. Until then, Palestinians and Israelis cannot know peace. 3 points. Hamas is a murderous organization, and its aspirations are no different than Al-Qaeda or ISIS. 22 years ago, the United States went to war halfway across the world. Today, Hamas is not halfway across the world, but is entrenched on Israel's border. Israel must be able to defend itself. Point number 2, defend itself and protect its citizens. And point number 3, the United States Congress, and the American people stand with Israel. Our relationship is unbreakable. Our commitment to Israel's security, to a Jewish, democratic state, is ironclad. Israel has no better friend than the United States, and the United States has no better friend than Israel. And to those who cheer Hamas, who turn a blind eye to murder, rape, torture, and kidnapping, you cast your lot with the barbarians and share in their shame. I yield my colleagues to support this resolution. I yield back.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from California, Mr. Issa.
Gentleman from California is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. You know, many in this body continue to say that no words can describe the horror that the Israeli people are facing. That's not true. There are words to describe it, and they have to be said. And some of those words are simply the facts, the real information that we're not seeing. One of them is that we are constantly hearing from pro-Palestinian groups that, in fact, you have a right to resist occupation. I have been in this body since 2001. I was in Israel under Ariel Sharon when he withdrew every single settler and every soldier from Gaza. Gaza has not been under occupation, just the opposite. When they didn't like the control they had after an election, Hamas seized by violence the control of Gaza, killing their fellow Palestinians. And since that time, they have been a war-making machine that has, in fact, been financed by Iran, equipped by Iran, and today it is Iran that owes an apology to the world, and the Palestinian people need to discount forever their association. I yield back.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from New York is recognized.
And I'll probably yield 2 minutes to another strong member of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, the gentleman from California, Representative Jim Costa.
Gentleman from California is recognized for 2 minutes.
I thank the gentleman from New York. I thank the chair and the ranking member for putting together this very strong resolution, H.R. 771. The United States unequivocally stands with the state of Israel and its people. The world is watching our actions today and tomorrow and will determine by our actions the future of democracies around the world. So therefore, we must be unified and bipartisan. Terrorism is never, ever justified. Israel has the right to exist and defend itself against Hamas, a terrorist group whose only purpose is to destroy the state of Israel and its people. Congress, therefore, and the President must together pass a strong bipartisan package to support our ally Israel. We must send a strong message to Iran, Syria, Hezbollah, not to escalate this situation. In the President's word, don't think about it. America defends its allies, Israel and Ukraine and other freedom-loving democracies around the world. We stand by our word. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Thank you, Speaker. I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Louisiana, the Majority Leader, Mr. Scalise.
Gentleman from Louisiana is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank Chairman McCall and Ranking Member Meeks for coming together on this critical, important piece of legislation, this first piece of legislation under Speaker Mike Johnson to stand with our friend Israel as they're under attack from Hamas and other terrorist organizations. Let's not forget what has happened, because there are reports that Iran and other terrorist organizations worked with Hamas for not only months, but possibly up to in over a year, planning these vicious attacks that now result in war and death of so many people, not just Israelis, Americans, hostages, so many injured, thousands more. This is horrific. This is an opportunity for people all around the world to stand with Israel's right to defend themselves. But as we look at the casualties, as we look at the devastation, the barbaric nature of the attacks coming from Hamas in Gaza, we must recognize that the funding that goes to these terrorist organizations can be stopped with stronger action from this Congress. And I know we're going to be coming together again to address some of those issues. We need to stand up against Iran's ability to sell oil on the world markets, because they use those billions of dollars in funds to also augment and fund terrorism to groups like Hamas. Everybody knows it happens. It's been going on for years and years, and it must stop. We must stand up against it. We must also freeze the $6 billion that still hasn't been transferred, but that was negotiated as part of a settlement that even Iran has admitted can be used for whatever purpose they want, including funding terrorism. We can't stand by and let that happen either. And as we're taking strong action to stand with Israel, our friend in the Middle East, we must also stand up to the anti-Semitism we see here in our country that pops its ugly head during ugly times like this. So I applaud my colleagues. Again, 425 co-sponsors on this piece of legislation shows that even in a divided Congress, we can come together when it's time to support our strongest ally in the region when they are under attack. We strongly stand with Israel. Let's pass this legislation overwhelmingly. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from New York is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I'm proud to yield 2 minutes to the former chair of the House Appropriations Committee and the current ranking member of the House Appropriations Committee, the gentlelady from Connecticut, Representative Rosa DeLauro.
Gentlewoman from Connecticut is recognized for 2 minutes.
I am devastated by Hamas's brutal attacks on innocent civilians in Israel, which include taking children, women, and elderly people hostage. I strongly stand by our ally Israel and unequivocally support its right to defend itself. This vicious assault was enabled by Iran, which has publicly praised the attacks. And now more than ever, it is vital that the United States does not walk away from its global commitment to defend democracy. This war is against Hamas. It is not the Palestinian people. And Palestinians have also lost communities and even loved ones because of Hamas's atrocities. Israel has to end Hamas's role in Gaza. And while we work together to minimize harm to civilian populations, but Hamas's presence is an assault on humanity. And I want to work with the unity government in Israel to create the conditions for peace again. As ranking member of the House Appropriations Committee, I am intent on ensuring that we do everything that we can to provide the humanitarian, military assistance that is necessary for Israel to recover from this devastation and continue to defend itself. And I yield back.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Tennessee, member of the Foreign Affairs Committee, Mr. Burchett.
Gentleman from Tennessee is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let's be honest, Mr. Speaker. If Hamas puts down its guns, peace will happen. If Israel does that, they will be slaughtered. These brutal attacks by Hamas terrorists, they've killed over 1,400 Israelis, over 200 hostages, including American citizens. I thought it was very telling when I saw a Jewish father, on the news was celebrating the fact that his daughter had died in the initial attack because he was afraid that she'd been abducted and all the horrible, horrible things these dirtbags would have done to her. We've had a few weeks here of discontent here in this body, but today I think we all stand united with Israel as a body. Israel and Jewish people have long been targets. Hamas must understand their time is over, and they are about to meet their fate and their maker. We stand in solidarity with the people of Israel. Their fight against these worthless thugs, Hamas, Hezbollah, and any other Iranian-backed terrorist group. Our enemies must know their commitment, that we are committed to our allies, and that they will die. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from New York is recognized.
I now yield 2 minutes to the former chairman of the Agricultural Committee, the current ranking member, the gentleman from Georgia, Representative David Scott.
Thank you very much. And the very first thing I want to say is this. Take note, those of you who are around the world watching this House of Representatives in action, that the very first bill that we are putting out is a bill to send a powerful message. We not only stand with Israel, we will fight with Israel. There's absolutely no way, as God is our maker, that we are going to stand by and see Israel destroyed. Make no mistake about it. It's as clear as bell in the Holy Scriptures, brought down by the mighty hand of God Almighty. Stand with my people, the people of Israel. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I was called upon as a member of the NATO Parliamentary Assembly to go to Iran, to write the paper on Iran. I met the people of Iran, and I want the people of Iran to listen. Go to your mothers, go to your leadership. They are the ones that control Hamas, Hezbollah. And then I call upon our friends in Saudi Arabia. The answer to this is in your hands.
Time has expired. Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Thank you, Speaker. I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Texas, member of the Foreign Affairs Committee, Mr. Jackson.
Gentleman from Texas is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Speaker, there has never been a more important moment in the relationship between the United States and Israel. I call upon this body to take all necessary actions to unequivocally stand with Israel as it fights for its very existence in this unprovoked war launched by Iranian-backed Hamas terrorists. I have and always will do everything in my power to stand with Israel. I, like the rest of the civilized world, have been disgusted with the unspeakable and barbaric atrocities imposed on innocent Israeli women and children by these animals that call themselves Hamas. We must enact policies to provide Israel with anything and everything it needs to defend itself, to immediately end all illegal aid payments to the Palestinian terrorists, and to hold Iran accountable. As long as I have a vote in Congress, I will always cast my vote in support of the Jewish state. And with that, I yield back. Thank you.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from New York is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I'm proud to yield 2 minutes to the Speaker Emerita, the gentlewoman from the great state of California, the Honorable Nancy Pelosi.
The gentlewoman from California is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the gentleman for yielding, and I rise in strong support of this resolution to support one of the closest allies in the world and partners, Israel, as she defends herself against terrorist attacks. I thank Chairman McCall for his leadership in bringing this to the floor, as well as Ranking Member Meeks for their leadership, working together, crafting this resounding statement of support and doing so in a unifying bipartisan way. Mr. Speaker, on October 7th, we watched in horror as Hamas terrorists unleashed a brutal assault on Israel's families and slaughtered. We've gone into some of the detail of the brutality of it all, outside the circle of civilized human behavior. Brutality. The attacks were horrible. With this resolution, the United States Congress resoundingly declares our support for Israel, not with revenge, but with justice, that justice will be done. And in doing so, we continue to remain concerned about the humanitarian situation in Gaza with civilians caught in the middle of the war. I echo Secretary Blinken's call for a humanitarian pause so that innocent lives can be saved. 80 years ago, Mr. Speaker, on the floor of this House, my father, as a member of Congress, Thomas D'Alessandro from Maryland, called upon the Roosevelt administration to support the establishment of a state of Israel in what was known as Palestine at the time.
He was early in calling for that. So it's in my DNA to protect that state of Israel. Hamas is dedicated to the destruction of the state of Israel. Hamas has been declared a terrorist organization by the United States. Hamas must be destroyed. But in destroying them, we must protect the children in Gaza. They use them as shields. We want to protect them. So this resolution, in overwhelming bipartisan support on the floor of the House, is so necessary. I urge a unanimous vote and thank the chairman and ranking member for their leadership.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Speaker, I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Kentucky, member of the Foreign Affairs Committee, Mr. Barr.
Gentleman from Kentucky is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in support of this important resolution affirming Israel's right to self-defense against this savage war perpetrated by Hamas and other Iranian-backed terrorists. While it was Hamas terrorists who invaded peaceful communities across Israel, decapitating babies, burning elderly women alive, kidnapping innocent civilians, including Holocaust survivors, it was Iran who was working behind the scenes to fund these acts of terror. I support this resolution because it calls out the mullahs in Tehran for funding Hamas and enabling this attack to occur. But how did this happen? In short, it happened because the Biden administration foreign policy allowed it to happen. Our government designated Iran as a state sponsor of terror, yet the Biden administration pursued a policy of weakness and appeasement toward Tehran. Since the Biden administration took office, Iran has generated approximately $80 billion in revenue from oil sales. And that's because this administration rolled back the Trump administration's successful maximum pressure campaign. In 2021, the administration lifted oil sanctions on Iran that were so helpful to the regime that the deputy chief of the Central Bank of Iran...
Additional 30 seconds.
Gentleman has been yielded an additional 30 seconds.
Thank you. The sanctions relief was so helpful to the regime that the deputy chief of the Central Bank of Iran said that Iran's foreign currency reserves were growing due to the growth of oil and other exports. For months, Secretary Blinken and National Security Advisor Sullivan and other administration officials have chased another JCPOA to release billions of dollars in sanctioned assets. And now we see the administration effectively incentivize Hamas to take American hostages by facilitating the transfer of $6 billion from South Korea to Iranian banks in Qatar, a deal that this administration claims it has frozen for now, but Qatar and Iran says is available to them today. Support this resolution.
First, gentleman from New York is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, let me inquire how much time remains.
Gentleman from New York has 7 minutes remaining. Gentleman from Texas has 10 minutes remaining.
I'm kindly yield 1.5 minutes to the gentlelady from Florida, Representative Debbie Wasserman Schultz.
Gentlelady from Florida is recognized for 1.5 minutes.
I thank the gentleman for yielding, Mr. Speaker. I rise in strong support of this resolution in the State of Israel and to speak out against the horrific murder of 1,400 Israeli civilians and the kidnapping of hundreds more. The unspeakable genocidal violence inflicted on Israelis and the Jewish people by Hamas terrorists goes beyond condemnation. It demands action. As part of a bipartisan and bicameral delegation, I was in the region in pursuit of peace when Hamas launched their cowardly attack on civilian communities. 3 days later, I met with Israelis' unified leadership and pledged continued U.S. support for the defense of the Jewish state. President Biden has led our nation in mourning the dead, praying for the kidnapped, and mobilizing to support Israel in eradicating Iranian-backed death cults like Hamas, Hezbollah, and Islamic Jihad, who are committed to the elimination of the Jewish people. Israel has never had a stronger ally, and the Jewish community has never had a stronger advocate, a stronger voice in the Oval Office. The unconscionable apathy of many nations, and many in our own nation, is a sobering reminder of the fact that Israel remains surrounded by hostility and danger. As a proud Jewish American and Zionist, let me be clear. Israel has a right to defend itself, and Hamas must be destroyed. As an advocate for peace, normalization, and a two-state solution, it must be stated that Hamas is the primary obstacle to all three. We should not tolerate Americans who rationalize massacres and lionize monsters while spouting off anti-Semitic tropes and accusations. I will not equivocate, because there is no equivalence between Israel's righteous efforts to protect its civilians and democracy from terror and Hamas using innocent Palestinians as a human shield, broadcasting carnage, burning families alive, and raping teenagers, girls to death.
Gentleman's time has
Thank
expired.
you. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Thank you, Speaker. I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Arkansas, a member of the Foreign Affairs Committee, Mr. Hill.
Gentleman from Arkansas is recognized for 1 minute.
I thank the Speaker. I want to thank the Chairman. I want to thank the Ranking Member for their work on this bipartisan, strong resolution. Iran and Russia are locked in a poisonous partnership committed to terror. Terror in Ukraine, terror in Syria, and Iran, as the world's largest state sponsor of terrorism, is further committed to the destruction of our ally, Israel. On October 7th, Iran's puppet, Hamas, commenced its most recent sick, savage slaughter of innocents. America, we were the first nation to recognize Israel in 1948. But over the decades, we have stood at her side when she's been attacked by force over her borders. We've stood by her side at anti-Semitic rhetoric in the halls of the United Nations. And together, we have been at the peace table seeking solutions. Today, united, we stand on this House floor in prayer for the safe return of all the hostages taken by Hamas. And I urge adoption on a strong bipartisan basis of this resolution in support of our ally of Israel. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from New York is recognized.
Yes, I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Michigan, Representative Thanadal.
Gentleman from Michigan is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Chairman McCall and Ranking Member Meeks. I rise in support of House Resolution 771. I firmly stand with Israel in the face of terrorism from Hamas. When I visited Israel in August, I saw how they were surrounded by threats. Now those threats have come true in the most violent and terrible possible way. Let me be clear. Our goal is the eradication of terrorists and terrorism from the face of this earth. We call on and expect the Israeli army to try to minimize civilian casualties, and we should make every reasonable effort to protect innocent Palestinians. But there can be no ceasefire until Hamas releases all hostages, stops its rocket attacks, and surrenders the leaders of the terrorist attack. Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from New Jersey, the chair of the subcommittee on Europe, Mr. Kane.
Gentleman from New Jersey is recognized for 1 minute.
I thank my friend, the chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee, for yielding me time. On the morning of Saturday, October 7th, Hamas launched the most brutal and expansive surprise attack on Israel since the Yom Kippur War 50 years ago. The world stood in shock as reports and images began to surface of civilians murdered, young children beheaded, and Holocaust survivors being dragged into Gaza as hostages. Like many of my colleagues in this chamber, I spent the past weeks engaging with the Jewish community leaders in my district, reassuring them of their community's safety and speaking with constituents who had to flee back to the United States. I stand here in support of this overwhelming bipartisan resolution, which has almost every single member of the House of Representatives as a co-sponsor. As the House of Representatives, we support Israel's right to self-defense and survival. We stand against Hamas, against its terror, and against its masters in Tehran. We stand with Israel in its fight for survival and against anti-Semitism in all of its forms.
Gentleman's time has expired.
Thank you, and I yield back my time.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from New York is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I'm proud to yield 1 minute to the gentlewoman from Florida, Representative Lois Frankel.
Gentlewoman from Florida is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you. My grandfather, Abe, he fled the Holocaust as 6 million Jews were shot and tortured and gassed and starved. We often said, never again, yet on October 7th, it happened again. And make no mistake, the brutal barbaric attacks by Hamas was not about freeing innocent people. It was about destroying Israel and killing Jews. And so today, I am proud to stand with all those who condemn Hamas, support Israel's right to defend itself, and reaffirm the United States' commitment to Israel's security. And I yield back.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Your Speaker, I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from New York, a member of the Foreign Affairs Committee, Mr. Lawler.
Gentleman from New York is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Chairman. Women, children, babies slaughtered. The worst massacre of Jews since the Holocaust. Israel has a right to exist, a right to defend itself. We have members in this body that do not believe that. Members in this body that cannot muster the courage or the strength to condemn the slaughtering of babies, but have the audacity to repeat a vile and disgusting lie that Israel bombed a hospital. They are not worthy of serving in this body. And the fact that we have people that didn't even sign on to this resolution tells you everything you need to know. If you cannot stand with Israel, our greatest ally in the Middle East, a beacon of democracy and hope and freedom, you do not belong in this body. Those members should resign in disgrace.
Gentleman from New York is recognized.
How much time remains?
Gentleman has 4 minutes remaining. Gentleman from Texas has 7 minutes remaining.
I reserve.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Kustoff.
Gentleman from Tennessee is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise today to speak in favor of this critical resolution to condemn Hamas's brutal attack on Israel and reiterate our nation's support, our strong support for our greatest ally in the Middle East, Israel. We all know that Hamas's heinous and unprovoked attack on innocent Israelis are barbaric. It is our responsibility as members of Congress to stand united with Israel. And let me be clear, Israel has a fundamental right to defend herself and her people during this conflict, during this war. I'm honored to be chairman of the bipartisan House Knesset Parliamentary Friendship Group. From both sides of the aisle, our members' support for the only democracy in the Middle East is absolutely ironclad. And this resolution demonstrates our unwavering commitment to Israel and our relationship. It's important for our nation and the rest of the world to hear this strong support and commitment from the United States House of Representatives. I thank Chairman McCall
Gentleman's
and
time has
Ranking Member
expired.
Meeks for their leadership, and I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from New York is recognized.
I yield 1 minute 30 to the gentleman from North Carolina, Representative Don Davis.
Gentleman from North Carolina is recognized for 1.5 minutes.
Thank you, Ranking Member. And Mr. Speaker, I rise today in strong support of this resolution, which expresses unwavering support for Israel. This past August, I traveled to Israel, and it was absolutely heart-wrenching as I think the very place that I stood just days later when I was in Israel. I was at the Kfar Aza kibbutz, where 58 people in the community was massacred. And we know 17 kidnapped. And it's just awful to think. Babies killed, people slaughtered, gunned down in cold blood. 33 Americans have lost their lives. Others are missing. Let's be clear. A nation must respond. And yes, we must respond. So let us continue to extend our unwavering support to Israel and ensure that the people of Israel have everything necessary to defend themselves and dismantle this egregious Hamas fighters. Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Texas, a member of the Foreign Affairs Committee, Mr. Moran.
Gentleman from Texas is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As a Christian, freedom-loving Texan and sitting member of the U.S. House Foreign Affairs Committee, the events in Israel these past weeks are of utmost concern. But beyond that, they should concern every American and, frankly, every member of humanity, regardless of religion, ethnicity, race, gender, or political affiliation. What we've seen in these past weeks is pure hate and pure evil. Hamas is a well-known Iranian-backed terrorist organization whose official charter calls for the obliteration of Israel and the Jewish people. Consider that for a moment. And these last few weeks have been proof of their commitment to this goal. So how should we respond in the United States? The U.S. should act strategically with strength and steadiness so that those enemies of the U.S. and Israel are overwhelmed and ultimately defeated in their entirety. We must stand firmly with Israel with whatever they need. Whatever they need. Now is not the time for timidity. It is the time for strength and unity with Israel. Such action will help deter evil in the future, preserve life, and promote liberty. Now is the time for us to be all in.
Gentleman's time has expired.
Offer strength and steadiness in this time. Let us begin
Gentleman's time has
by
expired.
standing with Israel. I yield back.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from New York is recognized.
I reserve.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Rose.
Gentleman from Tennessee is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Speaker, today I rise in support of America's greatest ally in the Middle East, Israel, its people, and its right to defend itself against the horrifying Hamas terrorist attacks that have taken the lives of so many innocent individuals, including 33 Americans. Since that deadly attack, I've been working to assist Tennesseans and their families and friends in Israel in their attempts to come home. I have also joined members of the Tennessee delegation in a letter to President Biden urging him to support Israel by any means possible, including by providing any weapons and munitions necessary and punishing all involved in aiding the Hamas terrorists. And lastly, I was proud to be an original co-sponsor of this resolution we are here voting on today, which reaffirms our commitment to Israel and condemns Hamas's brutal terrorist attacks. Mr. Speaker, we must do everything we can to protect and defend our friend Israel. Thank you.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from New York is recognized.
I continue to reserve.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Thank you, Speaker. I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Pfluger.
Gentleman from Texas is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, thank you. It's great to be back at work, doing the important work of the House. And the United States stands united in the face of the horrific, barbaric attacks on our greatest ally in the Middle East, Israel. The October 7th attack, nearly 50 years to the day after the Yom Kippur War, was horrific. 1,500 plus people murdered, hundreds more taken hostage, including American citizens. The brutality is unlike anything we've seen in modern times, with women and children being raped and babies beheaded. This cannot be the norm. Israel has every right to protect themselves, to defend themselves and their sovereignty. Our country must support Israel's efforts to protect its citizens and uphold its sovereignty without a question. With misinformation and the horrible pro-Hamas demonstrations across the world, the U.S. Congress must reaffirm our unwavering support for Israel. Together, we must work towards a lasting peace that ensures the security and prosperity of our Jewish friends and Israel. Let us stand shoulder to shoulder in this pursuit, unwavering in our commitment to justice, freedom, and the enduring bonds that bind our nations together. We stand with Israel. We stand with Israel today and forever. With that, I yield back.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from New York is recognized.
Continue to reserve.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Thank you, Speaker. I recognize or yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Idaho, Mr. Fulcher.
Gentleman from Idaho is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Speaker, I rise in support of Israel in H.R. 771. Israel is our most important partner in fighting terrorism. In fact, they are the first line of defense for the U.S. when it comes to terrorism because the sources of that terrorism is the same for both of us. Israel is a fabulous intelligence partner. I liken them to a giant antenna in the Middle East that serves and provides information to America. And as the only true democracy in the Middle East, Israel is a beacon for the American ideals of freedom, personal liberty, and a market economy. So my colleagues, let's stand together, support Israel, and support H.R. 771. Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from New York is recognized.
I'm ready to close.
Is the gentleman ready to close? Gentleman from New York is recognized to close.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Let me start out by thanking my friend and colleague, the chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, Mr. McCall, for his friendship, for working collectively together to making sure that the world knows that there is no daylight between us when it comes to us standing with our friend, our ally, the State of Israel. And I appreciate you. You know, when we first started this, after this horrendous attack on October the 7th, we had a conversation. We said, let's make sure that we put out a statement collectively, us giving our opinions as chair and ranking member of this committee. And then immediately thereafter, we went immediately to work on a resolution so that the world would know where the United States House of Representatives stood. And we thought we would get it done earlier, but we knew that the next thing that would, the first bill, the first resolution that would come to the floor after the House resumed this business would be this bill, because this bill is so significantly important to state that we have the back of our friend and ally, and we want to make sure that Hamas does not exist. You know, Mr. Speaker, I've had the privilege and the opportunity to visit Israel several times. I've been in some of those tunnels. I've talked to the people. And when I've talked to the people of Israel, all they say is they want to live in peace. When I talk to the people of Palestine, the Palestinian individuals in Gaza or in the West Bank, they say they want peace. But Hamas, terrorist organization, when you look at their mandate, they say they want the destruction of Israel. You cannot have peace. You can't even negotiate peace if one side says you should not exist. How can you say that you want a better relationship if you're saying that one side should not? If you're saying Israel should not exist. And you can't forget the horrific terrorist, ISIS-like atrocities that was committed on October the 7th. You cannot be silent. You can't sit back and make believe that it didn't happen, because it did. So, Mr. Speaker, I say as we end this debate, thank you, and thank you to the American people for standing with our friend and ally, the State of Israel.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Texas is recognized to close.
Thank you, Speaker. I want to thank my good friend, Mr. Meeks, as well. That's how this committee operates. And, you know, the fact that this is the most bipartisan resolution in modern history, with 425 co-sponsors, over 97% of this body, speaks volumes. And it sends a strong message to the people of Israel that the United States Congress and the American people stand firmly behind you. The Hamas covenant states, quote, ranks will close, fighters joining other fighters, and masses everywhere in the Islamic world will come forward in response to the call of duty, loudly proclaiming, hail the jihad. They say this cry will reach the heavens and will go on being resounded until liberation is achieved, the invaders vanquished, and Allah's victory comes about. In response to this, we must strengthen our resolve to stand with our ally, Israel. This resolution sends a clear and unequivocal message that the United States House of Representatives and the American people condemn the barbarity of the genocide and war crimes perpetrated by Hamas. And we want to make it clear that Israel has the right to defend herself to prevent an event like this from ever happening again. We want to assure you that the United States will be shoulder to shoulder with Israel, supporting her right to self-defense. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back the balance of my time. I hope everyone votes yes on this resolution.
Gentleman yields back.